How are you, PLO Order? Time for another video. This time it's about Q95 as brief appraiser out of position. So we open, we get one caller, flop is Q95, we are out of position. How should we proceed? And the theme is defense versus offense. So let's get into it. And the way this video is going to work, there's going to be some slides, some overall thinking, and then I will show the actual situation and some numbers with the marker and with poker choose. So you will see the both offense and defense. But the first question is offense or defense? Which one should we choose? And what do they mean? The thing is that the worse our opponent is, the more we go for offense. And I'm going to explain what offense means and what defense means. But the thing is that the worse our opponent is compared to us, the more we should go for offense. And the better our opponent is, the more we go for defense. And this makes sense. It's like in sports. If you're playing some types of sports and the opponent is way worse than you, there's no point in going for maximum defense. Just go on and win the game. But if you know that the opponent is better than you, you probably should start with defense-heavy strategy. And here's kind of graph that illustrates when the opponent is not good, we go for offense, and when the opponent is good, we go for defense. But there aren't many opponents who are 100% not good, or they are 100% good. Most of them are somewhere along this line, somewhere on the spectrum. And then you just have to figure out how much we want to go for offense and how much we want to go for defense. Like, we don't always go for full offense and we don't always go for full defense. It's somewhere in that line. And if you can figure out approximately where your opponent is, you know your game plan. Let's say the opponent is decent, but not so good. So he's somewhere around here. We know that we go slightly more towards offensive strategies. But if the opponent is somewhere around here, he's very good, we go more for defense. So it's important to understand that it's not black and white. You don't have to choose for full offense strategy or full defense strategy. You don't have two options. You have millions of options along the spectrum. How much we want to be on the offensive side, how much we want to be on the defensive side. And offense means exploiting opponent, defense means being balanced. So it's not either one. You don't have to think that, okay, I need to exploit my opponent as much as I can, or I have to be as balanced as I can. We can have both. We can be like here, where we're slightly more weighted towards offense. We exploit the opponent by being unbalanced, but at the same time, we have some balance in our ranges. We don't always do things like that. There are some slow plays, some strong hands in passive lines, and so on. So, let's talk about offense. My favorite. The leading thought is we don't need to be balanced if opponent can exploit, if we are not. So what this means, that if opponent is not good enough to exploit if we are unbalanced, then there's no point of being balanced. And the extreme example, let's say that on paired boards, we always bet small. An opponent calls with high pocket pairs or better. So high pocket pairs, trips, and full houses. And he folds everything else. So we can just bet everything we have and just print money out of him. And if he never adjusts to what we do, we don't have to change our strategy. We are very unbalanced. But if opponent keeps folding, we can keep betting. And we can do it for days, months, years. If opponent never adjusts and changes his strategy, we can keep exploiting. We don't have to be balanced. And this is something that people sometimes misunderstand. They think you have to be balanced. They say that, oh, you can't bet there 100% of times with your bluffs or air. because you're unbalanced and it's not good. And then I ask why. If opponent never adjusts, why shouldn't we? And they don't know the answer, but they just say you can't because it's wrong. It's not wrong. It makes money. But as soon as opponent realizes that, okay, that guy is betting every time, I need to do something, and then he figures out how he adjusts and he changes his strategy. That's when we need to readjust and change our strategy. Otherwise, his new strategy will beat us. So it's always a game of adjusting to each other. And that's the thing. In offense, we are unbalanced because it makes more money than being balanced. And as long as opponent doesn't prevent that, we can keep doing offense. But when he does, then we need to switch and start to think about defense a bit more. And we can use offense pretty much when opponent plays mostly his own cards. A lot of opponents do their decisions based on their own cards. They don't think about ranges, or they might, but they don't know how to implement that information. They don't define ranges. They just look at their own 4 cards. They look at the board. And 90% of the decision-making process is based on those. And that's where you can be unbalanced. Because opponent doesn't care what you have. He cares what he has. And that obeys the rules of probabilities. I will show you on Poker Choose how you can check out the opponent's range, and the numbers don't lie. If opponent plays certain range pre-flop, he will have certain hands post-flop according to probabilities. Sometimes he has good hands more often, bad hands more often, but in the end, the probabilities cannot be cheated. So offensive strategy is based on probabilities. We know that opponent cannot have a hand often enough based on our assumptions and estimations. If our estimations are wrong, then it sucks. Or if opponent changes strategy, it sucks. But as long as we are good in estimating stuff, opponent doesn't adjust, we print money. And we exploit his frequencies, which means how often he has a hand to defend. Like on Q95, I will show you that if we define ranges for opponent pre-flop and then the flop continuation range, we can pretty much see how much we have fold equity. And then we can decide, do we want to bluff that board or not? Then a few words about defense. Now, when the opponent is good, he can exploit us if we are unbalanced. Let's say that on those paired boards, we see bet 100% of our air. An opponent knows that. So he adjusts. He starts to raise us. He starts to call us. And if we keep betting, he will run us over. If our exploitive strategy is to bet flop, and if opponent calls, we give up, we check the turn. He starts to call with everything, and every time when we check the turn, we don't have trips or better, he bets we fold, and he starts to print money on us. And if we don't adjust, we are the one who's being exploited. So to defend ourselves, we need to pick up a counter strategy which has a bit more balanced and try to exploit our opponent. And the thing is that when we balance our strategy and adjust it, and opponent does it, and we do it, and everyone do it, then in the end, everyone has perfect balance, and that's when we have sober strategy. And the thing is, we don't have to be perfectly balanced. The smaller the stakes, the worse the average opponent is, the less we have to be perfectly balanced, or even balanced. But no one knows if we are perfectly balanced or not. Of course, I could say that no one is perfectly balanced. But the thing is that the only way opponent can know for sure how do we play a certain hand is if that hand goes to showdown. And let's say that on some kind of flop, opponent knows that sometimes when we bet the flop and hand goes to showdown, we had a strong hand. And sometimes when we check call or check raise, hand goes to showdown, we have a strong hand. And let's say there's 10 hands that went to showdown, and 5 of them we bet, 3 of them we checked, and 2 of those, 3 of those I check call, and 2 we check raise the flop. So he doesn't know out of 10 showdown hands, he can say that half of the time we bet our strong hands and half of the time we check. There's so much variance in it. And probably he didn't make notes out of that. And then hands on certain flop with our certain hand to go to showdown, that requires thousands and thousands of hands. And especially if we play smaller stakes, we rarely have hundreds of thousands of hands on any opponent, which we would need to get enough showdowns to make something out of his balance. Is he really well balanced or somewhat balanced? And out of those hundreds of thousands of hands, his strategy probably changed, our strategy has changed. So it's impossible to have the data to say if we are perfectly balanced. But it's enough if opponent sees that on Queen 9-5, we can check call with top set. He knows that we can do that. That's enough to be in balance. He cannot say that every time when we check, our range is capped. And we don't have to do it half of the time. It's enough if we do it once and he sees it. And good thing to remember is if hand doesn't go to showdown, opponent doesn't know what we have, so it doesn't matter whether we played the hand balanced or not. Of course, there are points and scenarios where just our frequency tells opponent something. I'd say those paired boards. If opponent thinks that, okay, he's betting very often those paired boards, and he goes to tracker and filters paired boards, and he sees that, okay, that guy bets, C-bets 90% of times on the paired boards, he knows that most of our range is air. He doesn't need to see our hand, he sees from the frequency that we are very unbalanced. But if we talk about dynamic boards, Queen 9-5, Queen Jack 7, Queen 7-3, Queen 7-5, Rainbow suited, there are so many different boards that it's very hard to figure out any frequencies even from the tracker, and most of the small stakes players, I would like to say 100%, but I'm going to say 99.99% of players are not going to do the work. They might check on specific boards like paired and monotone. I often say that paired boards, monotone boards are the special boards because it's easy to find frequencies in those. Because on monotone board, it doesn't really matter whether it's Queen 9-5 or Queen Jack 5 or whatever. It's still a very defined board. Either you have the flush or don't. So now we know the difference between offense and defense. We have to figure out the game plan. And to be good in poker, you should know both of them. You should know how to exploit your opponent, because that makes money. And you should know how to defend, because that saves money. And saved money is equal to won money. If the opponent is unknown, you have to use population tendencies. If you haven't done any population tendency analysis, it's just think about what's your average opponent. And it's based on the games, the playing field, the environment when you're playing. PokerStars PLO 25 Zoom is probably different than Unibet's PLO 25. Or some home game PLO 25. So just think about what your average opponent is. You should know how to play versus unknowns on your playing field. If you don't, then you have to do it now. Do the job. What's your standard strategy? And the thing is, about solver strategy, if you know it, then you know who's trying to use it. What this means that even if we don't ever want to use the actual solver strategy, it's good to know it, because then you know if opponent is trying to imitate solver strategy or if he's actually playing with solver strategy. And that tells you a lot about offense versus defense situation. And the thing is, no one plays perfect solver strategy. But you will see that on Queen 9-5 boards, the solver approach out of position is very different than what the offensive exploitative approach is. And I'm going to show you. Let's start with Q95. Too bad I cannot zoom it. I hope you have high resolution on the video. But here's the situation, cutoff versus button. So we are, or whoever is, out of position player is cutoff, and he has solver cutoff opening range. Button has button calling range, which is actually really tight. So on Q95 rainbow, solver is c-betting only 8.8% of times, which is very little. I mean, that's insanely small number. And to make it even more harder, if we filter or view these by categories, it shows here what kind of hands is bet and how often. And the highest frequency on c-betting is naked top 2, naked queen 9, which is bet only 17% of times. Which means that naked top 2 is checked 83% of times. So every hand category is really mixed strategy with heavy emphasis on checking. So if we want to simplify our life, we probably should say that we check everything on Q95 out of position. And when I think about small stakes, that cannot be super profitable. But the thing is, solver has the advantage of knowing exactly every opponent's range and strategy. So he can play perfectly. And the thing is, if we check out of position, and then button should actually bet 61% of the hands. So he should stab here very often. Probably because button range hits this board a little better. So when button bets, now as on the cutoff, once we check fold half of the hand, check call 40%, and check raise, well, 14%. So we check fold half of our range on Q95 rainbow. And that's how you play defense, because if we don't, the opponent can exploit us. And I would say that if you check call this board out of position, you're going to be in the world of pain, because taking passive line with medium strength hand out of position is the toughest spot you can be on poker tables, most likely. It's really hard to make it profitable there. Solver can do it because he knows exactly how to play every single hand combination on every single turn, because he knows the opponent's strategy. You don't. So that's the thing. And to go with solver and say that, okay, we check call here with most of our hands, then that's the easy part. Then what if the turn is 7 of spades? What do we do with the queen jack jack? We check opponent bets. And that will put us in really tough decisions on the turn and then on the river. Solver knows it. So I would say that if you are playing versus opponents that you need to have balance, then you should do a lot of solver work. Like the flop is the easy street, but how to play different turns, how to play different rivers. And then that takes, as you might remember, it takes a lot of time, because on the previous video about the game tree and how our decision opens new branches on the game tree, there's going to be a lot of options how the hand goes. So we can see that solver plays really passive. Bets only 8% or 9% of hands. So should we do that in real life? Well, here we have the magical hand on the poker choose. We are on the cutoff, we open, and I defined that we are opening 30%. Button calls. Now we don't have solver ranges in poker choose, so I set him to call with 20% of hands, which are all the decent hands or good looking hands, and he would 3-bet 6%. This might be a bit too much. The thing is that people are under 3-betting on this situation. Button should 3-bet more, versus kind of but people are not. So I gave him 6% as average player would do. And the flop is Q95, and now the question is, how should we play here? If we check, the first question is he stabbing 60% of times? And I can tell you that the answer is no. He's not stabbing here often. If we check, he's pretty much betting only for value. I don't think people would bluff here. There are so many turns that open up things. He always has probably at least some kind of backdoors. He's not stabbing here often enough. So if he's an opponent who plays only his own cards, now the question is, well, the first question is, can we bluff with anything? And now, if we go to the solver and we do bet, then button should fold only 32% of hands. He should continue with almost 70% of hands. So remember the number. In solver strategy, if we bet, we have only 30% fold equity. How much we have in real life? And that's what we can do with Poker Choose. I'm using the old Poker Choose because the new Poker Choose Cloud doesn't really support range distribution, and I tried to put the hand there, but there was some problem with the numbers. I didn't trust them, and I asked them, the support, that did I do something wrong or not, but the bottom line is that the numbers are not trustworthy at the moment for defining his range distribution. The actual range distribution is coming to the Poker Choose Cloud. When it does, of course, we use that one, but here I'm using the old one because we have range distribution and it shows how often opponent has certain hands in his range. All right? And if we decide to bet here, 3/4, then the thing is that if opponent folds more than 42% of hands, we start to make profit. And it's quite safe to say that if he folds half of his hands, we make profit. So if we estimate that we have over 50% fold equity, this is profitable. The thing is that in solver strategy, we had only 32% fold equity. But in real life, I would say that he would definitely call with any queen or better, which means any queen, any overpair, any two-pair, any set. Of course, he would raise, but this is his continuation range. Then he would definitely call with Jack 10 or better, which is the straight draw, or 6, 7, 8. And if we put mouse over here, you can see that Jack 10 plus equals to Jack 10, 8, 7, 6. So I would say this is the standard calling range. Like if he has some random 9, 6, 6, 3, he probably wouldn't call that often. But we can see what happens if he's wider. So, queen plus, Jack 10 plus, how often does he fold? And he has this kind of hand 60% of times, which gives us 40% fold equity. Now 40% is not quite enough. So, what if we have blockers? Let's say we have pocket jacks. Does this number go down? And it doesn't really, because Jack 10 is a small portion of his range. The number really doesn't change. The chance of him having the kind of flush draw, straight draw, goes down a little, but then the number of having queen goes up because we don't block it. All right? Let's say, what if we have a queen jack? So we are blocking the queen and we are blocking the jack. It's kind of really medium strength made hand. Should we bet it? Now it drops to 54, so we have 46% fold equity, which means that if we make the bet, then he is going to fold often enough. So it's really close. So we kind of need to block a lot of things. If we have a Jack 9, whoops, let's go to button. With Jack 9, it's not there. So Q95 is kind of board where we can bet decently often, but it's not the flop where we can just print money. If we have overcard blockers, it's still 60%. So we have around 40% for equity on this flop. And if we add 9, let's say with a cut shot or better. So 9 with a cut shot, it's actually a really small portion of his range, but now it goes up to 67. So if he calls with queen opener, any straight draw, and 9 with a cut shot, then he's going to call around the same percentage that solver would. And now the thing is, if we use 3/4 sizing, it's really hard to make it profitable. Now, if we change our sizing to half a pot, then that only has to work 1 out of 3 times. So if we get over 33% fold equity, then we could do it. So if opponent is calling on this flop with 9 and a cut shot, like 9, 6, 7, 9, Jack 8, then we have 33% fold equity. So once again, it's break even. But if opponent is calling with only queen opener and straight draws, and we bet half a pot, we need 33% fold equity, and we have around 60, which means that now we can bet very often on the flop if he folds to half a pot sizing. And now we change our standard sizing to exploit our opponent. We realize that this is a board where it's not that profitable to bet 3/4. But we know that if we generate the same fold equity with half a pot, then it becomes profitable. So then it's up to our opponent, should we bet it or not. So, what is our exploitative strategy on this flop? I would say that I would bet a lot of queen XX hands. Like queen with some kind of blocker, but nothing more. Let's say of course we shouldn't have this trappy hand, but I'm just trying to make that it's pair, slight blocker to straight draws, and then meaningless cards. So solver would definitely probably check this one, queen then. But if we bet, then with the queen blocker it takes away a lot of his top pair. Or let's put it this way, let's give us the ace, the king that blocks the overpairs. Like top pair and cut shot. And we have 50% fold equity. It's 100% guaranteed plus EV to make this bet. And even versus most of his calling range, we are flipping or slightly ahead. So we could hit the jack, we could improve, win at showdown. So even if he calls, we're not giving up the hand, but he's going to fold often enough for us to make profits. And if we have a line or strategy that is guaranteed plus EV, then to do something else, we need to have justification why it would be even more plus EV. And the thing is that if we check here, it's really hard to see how we can make the situation more plus EV than by betting. We can barrel a lot of turns, check call, check raise, a lot of options. But if we check an opponent bets and we check call the flop, then the problem is that we pretty much need to hit something on the turn to continue. If the turn is black and he fires again, we have to fold. And that's often the problem with passive lines, is often the only way to win the pot is to hit your hand, while on the aggressive lines you have two ways to win the pot. Opponent folds, or you hit the hand and win a showdown. And that's why it's always harder to realize your equity with passive lines. Solver does it perfectly. That's why Solver can play plus passive lines more frequently. But in reality, you cannot play passive lines as well as Solver does. That's why I would often try to avoid that unless I have to. So here I would much more likely bet this hand than check call with this hand. Or if we check opponent checks turn, is mostly scare cards, puts us in a bit of resistance, but it's somewhat easy to play that. But if we check an opponent bets, it's going to suck. So let's go back, and if we have here what we had, queen then. We don't have queen then. Alright, well, hang on, queen then 6-6. It has the queen and it blocks both straight draws. So this is a hand I would definitely bet. Solver would bet it only 20% of times. With two backdoor flush draws, it bets it. Then with two different backdoor flush draws, it checks, only bets 35% of times. That's because he wants to have balanced. But then overall 20% of times. While in reality, I would bet this versus unknown 100% of times because of the fold equity. End the hand there, pick up the profits that is offered instead of check calling. But if we check this opponent bets, then this hand is a fold 90% of times. So betting is guaranteed plus EV based on the numbers. Checking is pretty much guaranteed EV0 because we're going to check fold 90% of times. Some of the times it's check raised. I wouldn't do it because opponent doesn't stab here with air often enough. So if we check queen then 6-6, it's a check fold, even in solver strategy. So versus unknown, I would bet, but if the opponent is good and he doesn't fold to my bets, we know that he could fold us, he could raise us with bluffs, semi-bluffs, he could call with strong hands. I know that opponent has done work with solvers, so I cannot just overbet that flop. Then I would probably just check it and check fold. But the thing is that once we bet here, the opponent should fold 32% of times. And if we are blocking, he is calling range. This folding frequency goes up a little, so it becomes more and more break-even-ish. But that's the difference. Solver is very passive, out of position, even with his whole range. Like top set is a check call or check raise. When in reality, I would always bet my strong hands. Because average opponent is not aggressive. He's more of passive. So if we want to play a big pot, then most of the times we have to put money to the pot. Of course, if opponent has a strong hand, he is going to raise us and the money goes in. It's a setup. But on the hands that are not setups, opponents are more passive than aggressive on small stakes, which means to build up the pot, you have to do the work. Like Queen Jack 10 probably just calls here instead of raising, so if we have a top set, definitely want to bet barrel blank turns, make the pot as big as possible when we go to the river, instead of taking passive ones for defense. The thing is that the more you play defense, the more you keep pot small. And the more it's based because opponent can be aggressive, but if in reality they are not, don't go heavily on defense. And bottom line is you should know when to go for defense. And don't do it too much, because going for defense often means less profits in small stakes. So if for some reason you think that solver strategy is optimal on small stakes, you're wrong. It's that simple. I think I can say for 100% fact that it's wrong. But when you get up in stakes, the opponents become better, or there are good opponents at your games where you're playing, and you need to start to think about defense too. That's when you go more and more towards the defense. And if we go back here, back to the future, this is the spectrum we're interested in. Opponents are not good. Our strategy is weighted towards offense, but when we face good opponents, we start to slide towards defense. We don't go for full defense mode, but we go slightly, and you need to understand how to add defense on your strategy. And that's where the solver works is good, but the best outcome, in my opinion, is when we have the solver strategy. You know what absolute defense means, how it's worked. And then we work with poker choose to see the opponent frequencies. How can we exploit them? Okay, we know that opponent is not folding enough, he's going to do that and that and that. We can check how his range is constructed. Is there ways to exploit him in some other way, or how should we defend? And when you combine solver work with poker choose work, that's when you start to understand how offense and defense are connected. And then you can select where you end up on the spectrum. How much offense, how much defense. And I would say that, in my opinion, that's when the poker gets fun. It's like watching some old school high stakes poker where you see people soul reading opponents and changing gears and all of those old school things where you play versus the player, not the cards. When we start to think about offense and defense, that's the modern version of that, playing the player, not the cards. It's not soul reading anyone, but it's like trying to understand how opponent is adjusting and how do I need to adjust, and then outside the tables explore, compare different strategies, compare different lines, and try to figure out how should I adjust, when should I adjust, and why should I adjust. That's when poker gets fun, because you have to think. There are no clear answers. There are no softwares that tells you that you have to do this. You have to use your own skills and thinking and come up with a plan that beats your opponents. And that's how you can make money on the playing field. All right. I hope you enjoyed. Not much strategy, but Q95, it looks try sport, but it's not. Almost any turn besides 2, 3, or 4 of hearts open up something or complete something. So there aren't many blank turns. This is a board where turn and river, the equities shift a lot. There's a lot of board changing turns and rivers. And we should check a lot, and then opponent should stab a lot. And when he does stab, we should fold half and then fight with the rest. But yeah, it's interesting board. And these are the boards, before we end the video, these are kind of boards where you can either improve your win rate or decrease your win rate a lot. When you flop the nuts, or when the board is monotone or paired, those are the easy spots. Those are easy to solve. What's the good strategy would be, how to make money versus opponents. If the board is Q95 suited, it's a bit more easier. We don't really bluff that board. But Q95 Rainbow is kind of board where it's easy to make a lot of mistakes for either player. And if you can be the one who makes less mistakes and can outplay opponents, that's where you can make a lot of money. Alright, hope you enjoyed the video. How should we play it? How should we not play it? Like, the bottom line is, even when we want to go for offense, this is a board I would not attack heavily without some good blockers or weak queen XXX hands. Like, if we have a queen but not much, I would definitely bet basically to end the hand there, pick up the pot that is there, because check calling sounds a lot worse than betting. And the queen works more as a blocker to increase the fold equity, which sounds weird that we pretty much bet top pair more as a bluff. We don't really want our opponent to call. But it's, out of two bad options, I think betting is the less bad option compared to check calling. If our hand is stronger, we can bet, even try to check raise. Of course, I wouldn't, because opponent doesn't stab often. If our hand is worse, we can check, see if we can see the turn or not. But I would definitely be more aggressive than solver with hands that have blockers, because the folding equity is almost there. And then probably use slightly more sizing to increase the EV just a little. Alright, hope you enjoyed. Q95 offense versus defense. Of course, it's kind of board where the difference is not that clear. If the board was Q99, Q55, then the difference would be very different. But solver strategy on this board is complicated. With everything, it's very mixed. Very mixed. Like, before we end, oh, this just goes on and on. If we check opponent bets, then we're going to check raise 14% of hands. And we can see here on the very right that the frequencies, the highest frequency is top 2 with the draw, and that's check raised half of the times. And then check call half of the time. So even with top 2 with the draw, which is like top 2 with cut shot, queen jack 10 9, seems like monsters. Even those are not check raised. So there isn't a hand category that is always check raised. Like naked top set, check raised 15% of times only. Top set with a draw, check raised 28% of times. So it's really hard board to understand solver strategy because everything is so mixed. It's not like we always check raise top set. And I mean, we check raise naked bottom set 2% of times. Naked overpair over 9% of times. Bottom 2 with a draw check raise 15% of times, and it doesn't feel like naked top 2, bottom 2 pairs. Where's we have the bottom 2 pairs? Naked bottom 2 pairs 7% of times check raised. Wouldn't cross my mind to check raise 9-5 here. So solver strategy is very mixed. And when something is very mixed, it's very hard to learn, even when you make simplifications. So on this kind of board, it's really hard to play good defense. And if it's hard for you, it's hard for opponents. And then it's a board where you can make a lot of money if you can play it better than your opponent. Because probably even if opponent has done a solver strategy, his stabbing range here on the button is probably not based on these kind of categories. So his stabbing range is unbalanced, which means that it opens room for exploitation. But it goes very complicated. And it's interesting board. But I hope you enjoyed. At least it shows you how hard it is to have good strategies on certain boards. But the bottom line on the video is difference between offense and defense, and understanding when to go for offense, when to go for defense. And playing Q95 rainbow out of position is hard. Whether you try to play for offense, whether you try to play for defense, it's super hard. And it's really hard even to make the simplifications. So, good flop. Interesting one. I will see you on the next video. Meanwhile, enjoy your time on the PLO Order.